Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Johannes, for putting this event together and for coordinating. Thank you to all of the people, including Clara, who just walked in, for their work in coordinating all of us. Um, I am. I conducted most of the research for this talk today while a visiting professor at University of British Columbia. I'm no longer affiliated with them, but I thought I should give them credit up there. Um, I want to give a couple just warnings before I get started here. I'm remaining in my talk today mostly on the conceptual level. I don't have a whole lot of engagement with empirics at this point. The presentation is based off of a new line of thinking for me. This is all very, very new. In fact, this is the first time I've said most of these ideas out loud. So I very much look forward to all of your feedback and constructive criticism. The last warning before I get started is that this image that I'm putting up here is sort of a caricature of the processes that I'm going to be talking about today, and I think you'll see what I mean by this. I'm ending on an image that I think better captures what I'm talking about. But the idea behind my talk today is that is that I'm trying to think through where digital labor happens and how we can mobilize that question in multiple directions. As a geographer, the question of where and question of space is central to the work that I do. I'm going to jump right into the main argument, and then I'll slow down a little bit after that. The main argument that I'm making today is that digital labor research needs to rethink how it conceptualizes space, and specifically that a relational framework can better capture recent socio-technical transformations and advancements. That's the main argument that I'm going to be fleshing out today, and I'm going to be going over this a little bit more slowly as I move through this. I expect that most of this is going to be full of a lot of jargon that is not very familiar to most of you in the room, so I'm planning to go very slowly through this, so I hope that I won't lose you. In terms of organization, first I'm going to be basically just giving you an overview of what I mean by digital labor. And as you'll see, I think this is still up for a lot of debate, and that's kind of the point of today's talk. I'm going to be then spending most of the time thinking about two limitations that digital labor research faces when it comes to how it thinks about space, where the digital labor happens, basically. I'm going to be then spending quite a lot of time talking about a relational spatial thinking approach and how that might bring different processes and relations to the fore of our analyses when thinking about digital labor. And then lastly, I have just one example that I want to get into about that I think shows what I'm trying to get at. And I'm going to reread this example through the relational framework that I'm proposing. So first, when it comes to defining digital labor, there is quite a lot of persistent ambiguity around that term. Even as recently as 2020, Kylie Jarrett in this encyclopedia entry is still trying to lay down some basic definitions. There's still a lot of uncertainty around what exactly is digital labor, what constitutes digital labor, and what is beyond the purview of what we can think of as labor. Some of the earlier interventions, like this Christian Fuchs piece, are explicitly taking a Marxist approach towards understanding digital labor and using some of the classic Marxian categories to understand that. More across the board, there are lots of different interventions in the definitional direction that tend to focus on digital labor as emanating or emerging from the specific kinds of tasks that are approached. So people think of it as digital labor because certain things are done. So we have, for example, microtasking. Nancy has written on this. Gig work, so applications like Uber Eats and food delivery apps and that kind of thing. There's a lot of people who are writing on tech sector work, including Dan Cockayne. This is probably the most common, one of the most common areas of digital labor research is thinking about the people who are writing the programs, writing the software, writing the actual technologies in an office space. And then there are lots of people who focus on social media content, and this is sort of where it gets the most murky, is that a lot of people disagree with Christian Fuchs and Vincent Mosco when they argue that this constitutes digital labor, posting on social media. The reason why these and other people still call it social media tacks onto a lot of ideas around prosumerism, the idea that by posting on social media, you're producing the raw material or the commodity that is then sold. So they think that, according to the classic Marxian categories, that this is still digital labor. Still, recent transformations in data harvesting, surveillance capitalism, and cognitive capitalism have, I think, reanimated that need to continue considering both what counts as digital labor and the spaces in which it occurs. So in this talk, I'm going to be foregrounding these data practices that often unconsciously produce value just by virtue of you going through your everyday lives. So using Google Maps to find a shopping center or a restaurant, perhaps leaving a review of those spaces. A lot of people have mobilized the idea of digital colonialism and digital neo-colonialism to explain those relations as extractive and exploitative. The value producers, the people who are actually producing the data that makes these platforms and technologies run, those value producers are not paid the full value, the exchange value, of the data that they produce. But again, I just want to underscore that a lot of people argue that this still doesn't count as labor. There's a lot of people who argue for this idea of playbur, where people are playing and producing value, and so they're trying to make this portmanteau of playing and labor, playbur. But again, tacking back onto that idea of prosumerism, a lot of people are still arguing that this should be constituting of digital labor. And that ambiguity is really key to where I'm trying to make my intervention. Not trying to settle what exactly is digital labor, but trying to see how different kinds of labor come into our analyses by taking different approaches towards the spaces in which this occurs. I think that this research has two limitations. The first is that they either don't consider space at all in their analyses, that space is not an important component of the analysis, or that they take a Euclidean absolute perspective on space. And so let me flesh that out for you. The first part is the body of literature that frames digital labor as a strategy and productive process. And so this has a long history of thinking about how digital technologies disrupt labor markets, the organization of firms over space, the organization of firms and worker relations and that kind of thing. This is part and parcel of institutional and political economic reforms. We typically call them neoliberalism, of workforce management, labor markets, precarization, and firm profit strategy. A lot of people see this as utopian in nature. In this Verso book, Bastani argues that this is that automation, that digital technologies are going to liberate the masses because of shortening workday hours and increasing automation. Nick Cernisek surprisingly takes a surprisingly utopian view in that book as well. And then the automation and robotics plays a huge role in that body of work as well, with people taking perhaps not as utopian as the previous two examples. They're all very critical of that. Most of you are probably familiar with Virginia Eubanks' book, for example, and Martin Arboleda arguing about the automation of extractive industries. Okay, but so the key question for me as a geographer is, where is space in these analyses? Where are the spatial relations, and how does space shape these relations? The second limitation is that digital labor often is conceived, when space is considered, and when space does figure into the analyses, it is conceived as occurring within absolute spaces, like a nation state or a workplace. And these these absolute spaces are very conducive to Euclidean geometries that typically lead to classic and very traditional map products. So I want to give you an example of what I mean by this. And please understand that by putting this particular example up on the screen, I'm not saying anything about the quality or importance of this particular research project, but more to give an example of what this kind of digital labor research looks like. And so what you see here is edits to Wikipedia, but aggregated to the national level. So the digital labor occurs within, in this example, these nation states. Another example, it comes from a different article where they have looked at different kinds of micro work and microtasking and temporary precarious digital labor, but they've aggregated to these categories of developing countries, Africa, Asia, Latin America. Again, these Euclidean geometries rooted in a Westphalian notion of the nation state. The workplace still figures very strongly in this research as well. I love this book, Melissa Gregg's Work's Intimacy, where she's arguing that that digital technologies have expanded the workplace beyond just a traditional desk in an office. People are now working on trains, in coffee shops, in informal working settings, in group work, and that kind of thing. And what I like about that is that it's displacing the centrality of the traditional workplace in the analyses, but it's still recentering it on other absolute spaces like the coffee shop and the train and so on. In these analyses, space is a container in which social process occurs, what Batholt and Johannes have called an atomistic view of economic agents, where economic agents are individual units that perform certain kinds of activities. I would argue, and I would welcome any challenges to this, but I would argue that this narrows the conception of work to discrete and remunerated activity, a very intentional act that is meant to produce a certain kind of value or certain kind of outcome. So in other words, by taking this Euclidean or absolute framework, it shapes how we think of what work is. What I want to propose is that we can rethink digital labor by adopting a relational spaces framework, by thinking about actors and spaces as constituted by their relations rather than as individual containers or individual isolated actors that have that act in absent of these relations. Let me slow down and break that apart for you. A relational perspective, for those of you who are not familiar, sees actors or even space as fundamentally and foundationally constituted by the relations in which they are situated, in which they operate. So I just have an example up here. This image is not really important, but instead of visualizing a traditional topographic map that shows the elevation, as you can see over here, they're actually showing the topologies between the places. So what matters is the relation between spaces rather than their absolute location on the surface of the Earth. In a relational spaces framework, space is not a container in which things happen. The United States or Germany or Canada are not the places in which digital labor occurs, but are instead active agents shaping social processes. And importantly, spaces don't pre-exist the processes that occur within them. They're actively produced in order to facilitate those processes and relations. So space doesn't pre-exist those relations and processes. Now, what I want to make sure it's clear that I'm arguing here, I'm not arguing that absolute spaces and Euclidean geometries don't exist or don't matter, but that shifting our focus to a relational perspective draws to our attention different kinds of processes and relations. So to be clear, absolute spaces are still there. Absolute spaces are still influential. They matter. Jurisdictions, for example, laws and protections and agreements and so on. But that at the same time, there are these relational spaces that are also occurring. Okay. So I have a couple of quotes, just in case this is new to you. I have a couple quotes that I think might illustrate more what I'm talking about when I say relational spaces. I just want to make sure that this is clear what I'm trying to get at here. In 2006, Murdoch in a book argued that spaces in a relational framework should not be seen as closed and contained, but as open and engaged with other spaces and places. So what's important is the relations between these spaces again. Vicki Lawson and Sarah Elwood argued that a relational perspective contains a tripartite approach towards knowledge production, that it conceptualizes space itself as constituted through relations that extend beyond a singular place, as I've said. It is also, so that's sort of an ontological argument, but the epistemological argument is that it's open and to contingent and often contradictory relations. And third, that it involves a politics of possibility that disrupts hegemonic modes and relations of knowledge production. Going back to this article I'm going to cite a couple times in this talk, Batholt and Glickler argue that a relational framework focuses our attention on the economic agents that are situated in contexts of social and institutional relations, that contextuality leads to path-dependent development, and that Despite this path-dependent development, economic action is subject to unforeseeable changes and is therefore fundamentally open-ended. I believe that's a direct quote, but I didn't put quotes around it, so I don't remember. And lastly, Marcus Dole argues that a relational framework reminds us that space is continuously being made, and that's the important word there. The space is made, that it is unmade and remade by the incessant shuffling of heterogeneous relations. Interestingly, I think this is going to resonate with many of you in the room today, that economic geography is probably one of the biggest areas in which these ideas have flourished. There's been a relational turn in economic geography since at least the beginning of the century that, that draws on some of the earlier work of say, Doreen Massey, and takes it in really interesting and productive directions. I'm not going to get into this in a whole lot of detail, but I just want to acknowledge some of the vast amount of literature in economic geography that is taking these ideas in productive directions. So just to be clear, Doreen Massey argues that places and spaces should not be seen as isolated just coordinate pairs, basically latitude and longitude, but as the nexus of global flows of capital, of ideas, of relations, and of histories. So, for example, she has this example of walking down a street in Kilburn in London, where she sees Indian restaurants and falafel shops and different kinds of shops from representing cultures from around the world. And she notes that this is due not just to the histories of colonialism of the United Kingdom, but also due to current economic restructurings and relations across the globe. And then just a whole swath of other related research that takes this in very important directions. Boggs and Rantisi argue for a relational turn in economic geography. The title of the article that I keep referencing here is Toward a Relational Economic Geography. There's Rethinking Relational Economic Geography, and then another article by Nancy here, a Relational Perspective on Economic Geography. Okay, so what does this mean for how we think about work? I've argued that the Euclidean and absolute space perspective and framework gets us to think about work in a particular way, that specifically as discrete occurrences of remunerated work that typically take place in a working environment. A relational framework, in contrast, draws to our attention things like attentional economies. In this famous Senate hearing, Mark Zuckerberg was asked how Facebook makes money if it doesn't charge its users a fee, and he responded, "Senator, we run ads," and made his classic robotic smile. So what I'm going for here is to think about the use of social media and paying attention as a generative process, a generative practice. There are lots of connections in media studies to Dallas Smythe's idea of the audience commodity here, if you're familiar with that line of work. And the idea is that by seeing these ads, by clicking on them, by paying attention to them, that you are generating value, a lot of value for social media companies and for other economic actors and agents. A relational perspective also draws to our attention how spaces are produced for affective effects. What I mean by this is feelings of solidarity, feelings of community, identity formation, social meaning, all of these are written into the spaces that are produced for the circulation of values and norms in social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. We were having this conversation last night, and I think I'm still putting a lot of thought into this. A simple example is that a friend on Facebook might post an image of themselves doing something important for them, perhaps graduating, going on a vacation, having kids, whatever the case may be. And the idea is that this is supposed to elicit a certain kind of affective response by you. You like it, you love it, you provide care or laugh, and so on and so on. And so the emojis in this sense are sort of a mechanism to capture those affective responses. But by participating, you're producing value within these platforms. And lastly, it draws to our attention the, the idea that a lot of work is performed without intending to perform that work. So I have an example here of an exercise app called Strava that, if you go for a run or ride your bicycle or swim, you sometimes just turn on your smartwatch or your phone and it tracks where you go. It tells you how far you went, what your pace was and all that stuff. It's very useful, but Strava collects all of that data and you have no control over how they're going to use that data anymore. In fact, you really don't know at all how they're going to use it. So one of their products is this global heat map that they actually charge money to view at a granular level to show where people are exercising, basically. Or if any of you have traveled through any of these airports to get here, you may be surprised to know that your phones were being monitored. Specifically, the Bluetooth device on your phone was being monitored as you walked through it to measure foot traffic and congestion and those kinds of things. If you've ever driven or traveled on a highway towards an airport and they have those signs that say 15 minutes driving to the airport, that's also the same mechanism. They're measuring how fast Bluetooth devices are going through their sensors. So you're producing data just by living your everyday life, and private companies like BlipTrack are collecting that data, harvesting it, and doing things with it that we don't actually know what they're doing. Okay, so lastly, I have an example that I want to offer that I'm going to reread through this relational framework that I hope is going to illustrate the stakes of what I'm talking about right now. And I apologize for this specific part. I have a script that I want to read because I want to make sure I get this right. But this is an example that is a very recent article published in the journal Digital Geography and Society by, I forget their names, but Santala and McGurk. And I found this example really interesting for a lot of reasons. I want to turn to this recent intervention by Santala and McGurk that productively approaches the theoretical stakes that I've outlined here. By dwelling on this piece for just a few minutes, I intend to reread digital labor's theoretical tenets through the material Santala and McGurk offer us. In this piece, the authors discuss the construction of what they call the sharing city, constituted by 3 digital platforms. I have just images from 2 up here, but 3 digital platforms that mediate the practice of sharing items such as tools and green waste compost. Each of the 3 platforms were created by community members, and each contains a map showing where a user has self-reported the availability of some item for sharing. In other words, the platforms feature crowdsourced maps. The community members are producing the data. They produce the platform itself, but they are also producing the data, monitoring it, and mediating it, and so on. Insofar as the platforms were created by those community members and their data are intentionally produced by users, I think these platforms can very fairly be considered digital work. Maybe not digital labor, but that might be a different conversation. Definitely digital work. As well, these maps represent data using Euclidean geometries. On the right, up there, you can see that this is just a very traditional map where the data are positioned on the map according to their absolute spaces, their latitude and longitude coordinates. So they do capture absolute spaces. And in both of these ways, the platforms facilitate the epistemological framework commonly mobilized in digital labor research. However, instead of focusing on those discrete locations of map data within Euclidean space, Santala and McGurk, the authors, pay attention to the relations that subtend and emerge from these technologies and data. For them, the platforms and their data are merely surface manifestations of deeper socio-political relations and imperatives. More specifically, they contend that the practice of sharing involves rebuilding and maintaining interdependent relationships situated within urban political economy. So in other words, what's most interesting for them is not just where are those data being dropped. Is there a cluster here? Is there a cluster down here? They're not so much interested in those absolute spaces, but in the social and political relations that subtend it, that are underwriting it. Speaking of one of the platforms, they argue that, quote, it sought to find more interdependent solutions to several urban challenges ranging from the lack of social connection to the predatory aspects of commercial platforms, end quote. For another platform, the sharing map, which I believe is the one on the top right, it ended up constructing an alternative economy, quote, based on caring and fairness, end quote. So the authors explicate that each of the communities had congregated to coordinate and plan a strategic political economic intervention through their digital labor, and they can, in a sense, be read as being constituted by and constituting an important spatial relation. The community's digital labor then, quote, produced the capacity to collectively contemplate and reconfigure existing social norms. For the authors, the important social process is found less in inquiring, as I said, about the Euclidean geometrical placement of data within the representations of absolute space, and more about the social political problems that prefigure the envisioning of new socio-technical assemblages like the platform. In this way, thinking about the relational spaces within which digital labor occurs has much greater explanatory power towards social, political, and geographic processes. And so, the last point that I want to make here is that I want to connect this to this sort of respatialized digital labor to a piece co-authored by another member of this workshop, Jeremy Crampton. What I'm encouraging is thinking about the geographies of digital labor, quote, beyond the geotag. The latitude and longitude are not what constitutes an activity's geographies, but rather the production of new, we can think of it as sort of territory, for enacting social meaning and social relations. So in conclusion, I want to offer some take-home points. To put this relatively simply, what I'd like for you to have taken out of this talk is that digital labor typically either does not consider space at all or thinks of it in Euclidean and absolute terms, but a relational framework helps us think about how digital labor occurs across, through, and without, in a lot of cases, typical Euclidean geometries. This shift also reframes what we think of as constituting digital labor and work writ large toward attentional economies, affective spaces, and unremunerated work. And I'm ending just a couple minutes early, so I hope I pace myself well. But ending with this image, which is a little bit more of what I'm talking about, people just using Google Maps to get around the city, rather than that first image of people in front of a bunch of keyboards. So thank you so much for your time and attention.